It's not enough. Congress must pass a war powers resolution to prevent a needless and reckless war with Venezuela and any other country Trump decides to attack on a whim. Trump says he is going to war with drug traffickers. This is hypocrisy of the highest degree. While Secretary Hegseth was busy blowing up boats of suspected drug dealers, Trump was pardoning former Honduran President Hernández. Hernández was tried, convicted, and sentenced for bringing in 400 tons of drugs to America. There was proof and evidence in a court of law, not random airstrikes and a declaration of a forever war that Congress has not authorized.
What you have just witnessed in that chamber is not merely political theater or another moment of partisan disagreement to be filed away in the endless archives of congressional squabbling. What you have seen is a Democratic Congresswoman naming with precise and devastating clarity the central moral contradiction of this entire fetid administration. And I want you to stay with me here because we are about to unravel something so grotesque and so transparently hypocritical that it should shake the foundations of how we understand Trump's so-called war on drugs, and more than that, how we understand the entire authoritarian project currently unfolding in the Caribbean and throughout Latin America under the guise of fighting narco-terrorism. Representative Teresa Leger Fernández has delivered a verbal precision strike against Trump's latest imperial venture, and the footage you just watched contains within it the seeds of a moral reckoning that should terrify anyone who believes in international law, congressional authority, or basic human decency. Let me paint you the picture that should be seared into your consciousness right now, because this is the moment when the mask slips completely off and we see the architecture of lawless violence that defines Trump's second term. Since September, at least 87 people have been killed in 22 strikes on 23 vessels in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, operations that the Trump administration has not publicized any evidence for its allegations that these vessels were operated by narco-terrorists. Picture that for a moment. Close your eyes and envision the most powerful military apparatus in human history, guided by satellite surveillance and drone technology that can read a license plate from space, launching Hellfire missiles at fishing boats in international waters, and then refusing to provide a single shred of evidence to justify these extrajudicial killings. Experts, human rights groups, and international bodies said the killings were illegal under U.S. and international law, and the Colombian and Venezuelan governments have accused the U.S. of extrajudicial murder. But wait, because it gets so much worse that you need to sit with the full depravity of what has been reported. In November 2025, The Washington Post reported that 2 anonymous sources said Hegseth had given a verbal order to SEAL Team 6 to leave no survivors. 2 men who survived the initial strike were killed in a subsequent double-tap strike. Let me say that again, because the horror of it needs to penetrate fully into our collective consciousness. The Secretary of Defense allegedly ordered a follow-up strike specifically to kill survivors clinging to wreckage in the open ocean. They were alive in the water, holding on to the wreckage when they were killed in a subsequent strike, with the command to kill the survivors issued by Admiral Frank Bradley, the Special Operations Commander overseeing the mission, complying with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's verbal command to kill everyone on board. This is what international law calls a war crime. This is what the Nuremberg precedent was designed to prosecute. And this is happening right now under an American flag with your tax dollars. Now we arrive at the heart of Representative Leger Fernández's devastating critique, the hypocrisy that reveals this entire bloody campaign to be nothing more than imperial adventurism dressed in the language of drug interdiction, while Secretary Hegseth was busy authorizing the killing of alleged drug traffickers without trial, without evidence, without even the pretense of due process. President Donald Trump granted a full and complete pardon to former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernández, who prosecutors accused of conspiring with drug cartels to move more than 400 tons of cocaine through Honduras toward the United States. 400 tons, not the alleged contents of a speedboat, not speculation based on satellite imagery. According to the indictment, from about 2004 to 2022, Hernández participated in a corrupt and violent drug trafficking conspiracy to facilitate the importation of tons of cocaine into the United States, receiving millions of dollars from multiple drug trafficking organizations, including from Joaquin Guzman Loera, El Chapo. This man was tried in a court of law. This man was convicted by a jury of his peers. This man was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison for crimes that were proven with evidence and testimony, and Trump pardoned him. Do you understand the moral incoherence we are witnessing? Do you grasp how this completely eviscerates any claim that these Caribbean strikes are about protecting American lives from drugs? Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia called the decision shocking, stating Hernandez was the leader of one of the largest criminal enterprises that has ever been subject to a conviction in U.S. courts, and less than 1 year into his sentence, President Trump is pardoning him, suggesting that President Trump cares nothing about narco-trafficking, and Kaine is absolutely correct, because this is not about drugs. This has never been about drugs. This is about regime change, and hemispheric dominance, and the reassertion of American imperial prerogatives in Latin America. The geopolitical chess game here is so transparent, it would be laughable if it weren't soaked in blood. Hernández is a right-wing figure from Honduras's Conservative National Party, and Honduras's outgoing president, Xiomara Castro de Zelaya, is allied with longtime U.S. foes in Latin America, Cuba, Nicaragua, and especially as of late, Venezuela. Trump pardoned a convicted drug kingpin because that kingpin is ideologically aligned with American interests, because he moved the Honduran embassy to Jerusalem, because he represents the kind of compliant neocolonial leadership that Washington prefers in its backyard. Meanwhile, given the magnitude of the U.S. military buildup and show of force, the claim that the objective is fighting drugs is not credible, with Venezuelan opposition figures, Trump administration sources, and independent political analysts suggesting that the U.S. true motive is regime change. Let us consider the scale of the military deployment, because this is where the pretense collapses entirely under its own weight. Trump has deployed the world's largest aircraft carrier, USS Gerald R. Ford, thousands of troops and F-35 military jets to the Caribbean. The U.S. has amassed 15,000 troops in the region. 15,000 troops, an aircraft carrier strike group, fifth-generation stealth fighters. Does anyone with functioning critical faculties believe this is a proportional response to interdicting drug smugglers and speedboats? The administration did not supply evidence that the boats were carrying drugs, and drug experts said that Venezuela plays a minor role in trafficking drugs that reach the U.S. barn with U.S. The entire narrative is a fabrication designed to provide legal cover for what multiple international bodies have called crimes against humanity. And speaking of legal cover, let us examine the constitutional crisis embedded in these operations, because Representative Leger Fernández is demanding that Congress pass a war powers resolution, and she is absolutely right to do so because what Trump is conducting is war without authorization. The Trump administration is facing mounting congressional pushback over more than 20 military strikes in Caribbean, with at least 22 strikes near Venezuela. Neither the 2001 nor the 2002 authorizations for use of military force gained enough Republican support to pass when Democrats attempted to block these operations. Senators Tim Kaine, Rand Paul, Chuck Schumer, and Adam Schiff filed a war powers resolution to block the use of the U.S. armed forces to engage in hostilities within or against Venezuela, unless authorized by Congress, after President Donald Trump said that land operations would begin very soon. The constitutional framework here could not be clearer. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution vests the power to declare war exclusively in Congress, not in the executive branch, not in the President, not in the fever dreams of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Since the founding of our republic, the Constitution has vested one power clearly and exclusively in Congress, the power to declare war. Congress has not declared war on Venezuela, said Leader Schumer, yet Trump has declared exactly that, announcing in October 2025, Trump formally notified Congress that the U.S. was in a non-international armed conflict with unlawful combatants regarding drug cartels in the Caribbean, a legal maneuver so brazen and constitutionally dubious that it represents nothing less than a unilateral executive seizure of war-making authority. Now I want you to think about the mechanics of this alleged drug war, because the details reveal a campaign of state terror. The New York Times and Associated Press reported that national security sources acknowledged that the boat seemed to be turning back when it was hit. Turning back. The first boat that was struck, the one that Trump posted video of on Truth Social like some kind of grotesque propaganda victory lap, was apparently reversing course when it was obliterated by American military power. These were not combatants engaged in hostilities. These were not armed militants threatening American forces. These were people on boats who were executed from the sky, and in at least one documented case, survivors were then hunted down and killed in a second strike to ensure total annihilation. The legal scholars are unequivocal about what this constitutes. GOP Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky told reporters that there's a broad consensus that it's illegal to kill people who are clinging to wreckage. A spokeswoman for UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Turk's office said Turk believed that airstrikes by the United States of America on boats in the Caribbean and in the Pacific violate international human rights law, adding that the strikes were taking place outside the context of armed conflict or active hostilities. A former ICC chief prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo, told the BBC that the strikes would be considered under international law as crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity. Not hyperbole. Not partisan exaggeration. The considered opinion of a former chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Let me be crystal clear about what is at stake here, because we are witnessing the architecture of fascist violence being constructed in real time. Trump has asserted that he does not need congressional authorization for these killings. Trump told reporters at the White House, "I don't think we're necessarily going to ask for a declaration of war. I think we're just going to kill people that are bringing drugs into our country. We're going to kill them. They're going to be like dead." This is the President of the United States announcing that he will serve as judge, jury, and executioner, that he will determine who lives and dies based on his own authority, that the entire framework of law and constitutional restraint is an inconvenience to be brushed aside in pursuit of his geopolitical objectives. And the geopolitical objectives, let us be absolutely clear, are about reasserting American hegemony in Latin America through violence and intimidation. Washington's recent show of force recalls a long history of military interventions across Latin America by successive U.S. governments, often motivated by fear of hostile powers close to U.S. borders. This is Monroe Doctrine militarism on steroids. This is the School of the Americas producing another generation of state-sponsored death squads. This is Operation Condor for the 21st century, except now they are not even bothering with the Cold War pretext about communist infiltration. Now they are simply declaring that drug trafficking, the very drug trafficking that Trump pardons when committed by right-wing allies, justifies unlimited military force anywhere in the hemisphere. The complicity of Congress, particularly Senate Republicans, in enabling this criminal enterprise cannot be overstated. Neither resolution gained enough Republican support to pass when Democrats attempted to invoke the War Powers Resolution to block these operations. Trump's Republicans in the Senate blocked a resolution in November that would have prevented him from attacking Venezuelan territory without congressional authorization, and in October, Senate Republicans blocked a resolution that would have stopped the boat strikes. Every Republican senator who voted to allow these strikes to continue is complicit in what international law defines as extrajudicial killing. Every single one of them has blood on their hands. And yet amidst this moral catastrophe, amidst this constitutional crisis, amidst this descent into lawless imperial violence, we have Democratic lawmakers like Representative Teresa Leger Fernández standing up and naming the hypocrisy with devastating precision. She is pointing to the fundamental contradiction that exposes the entire rotten edifice, that Trump is pardoning convicted drug traffickers who moved 400 tons of cocaine while simultaneously claiming that alleged drug traffickers on boats, for whom no evidence has been provided, must be executed without trial in international waters. This is not drug policy, this is not national security, this is gangster imperialism dressed up in the language of law and order. Consider the Orwellian dimensions of Trump's rhetoric around these killings, because the cognitive dissonance is designed to short-circuit rational analysis. Trump said U.S. military strikes on 5 Venezuelan boats have saved more than 100,000 lives, because the maneuvers thwarted drug smuggling, claiming every boat that we knock out, we save 25,000 American lives. This is numerological fantasy. This is propaganda so divorced from empirical reality that it exists in a realm of pure ideological projection. The CDC reported 73,000 drug overdose deaths from May 2024 to April 2025, meaning the drugs on 5 boats would have been responsible for 125,000 deaths, nearly double the number of U.S. overdose deaths in 1 year. The math does not work. The logic does not work. The entire premise is a lie designed to justify murder. But the lie serves a purpose, and that purpose is to normalize extrajudicial killing, to accustom the American public to the idea that the president can order people killed anywhere in the world without evidence, without trial, without congressional approval, simply by declaring them to be threats. This is the logic of the drone warfare program that Obama expanded, and Trump has now taken to its logical conclusion, except now they are not even pretending that these are targeted strikes against specific terrorist leaders. Now they are just blowing up boats full of unnamed people and calling it counter-narcotics operations. And the international response reveals how isolated and lawless the United States has become under Trump's leadership. It was publicly reported that the United Kingdom's Attorney General was urging ministers to cut off intelligence sharing with the United States over serious concerns about the legality of the Trump administration's unauthorized and lethal strikes, and the UK spy agencies and military stopped sharing intelligence with the US about suspected drug trafficking vessels. Think about that, America's closest intelligence partner, the country with which we share the most intimate national security secrets, has cut off cooperation because they believe these strikes are illegal and they do not want to be complicit in war crimes. This is how far Trump has dragged American credibility and moral authority. The legal architecture that the administration is attempting to construct to justify these killings is so flimsy and so transparently cynical that even military lawyers within the chain of command have objected. It was publicly reported that the senior lawyer at Southcom, the combatant command overseeing those strikes, disagreed with the administration's assertion that these strikes are legal and was overruled, and Southcom's senior military lawyer raised serious concerns over the legality of the Trump administration's plans to begin the boat strikes. The lawyers whose job it is to ensure that military operations comply with domestic and international law are saying this is illegal, and they are being ignored or fired. Admiral Alvin Holsey, the commander of United States Southern Command, announced that he would retire at the end of the year, less than a year into what is normally a 3-year placement, with anonymous sources reporting tension between Holsey and the Trump administration over Venezuela. The commander responsible for Latin America quit rather than continue to oversee operations he apparently believed were illegal or immoral. This is a full-spectrum assault on the rule of law, and it is happening in our name, with our tax dollars under our flag. Representative Leger Fernández is calling for Congress to pass a war powers resolution, and every single member of Congress who believes in constitutional governance should support that resolution immediately, because what Trump is conducting in the Caribbean is an unauthorized war, and if Congress does not assert its authority to check executive military power, then the separation of powers that defines our constitutional system is finished. But let us zoom back out to the bigger picture, because these strikes are part of a broader pattern of Trump administration lawlessness that should terrify anyone who values democratic governance. Trump has declared that land strikes inside Venezuela could come imminently, which would represent an unprovoked military attack on a sovereign nation with which the United States is not at war. The United Nations responded to U.S. actions by stating, "These actions violate the fundamental international obligations not to intervene in the domestic affairs or threaten to use armed force against another country." This is the United Nations, the body created after World War II to prevent exactly this kind of aggressive militarism, saying that the United States is violating fundamental international law. And the humanitarian consequences of this campaign are being completely ignored in American media coverage because the victims are brown people in the global South, and therefore their lives apparently do not matter. As of 4 December 2025, at least 87 people have been killed in 22 strikes on 23 vessels, including one missing survivor who is presumed dead. 2 other people survived one of the attacks and were repatriated to their home countries. 87 human beings, people with families and communities and lives, obliterated from existence without charges, without trial, without even the dignity of having their names recorded. They have been reduced to statistics in Trump's propaganda about saving American lives from drugs, their deaths justified by a mathematical fantasy that cannot withstand even cursory scrutiny. This is state terrorism. There is no other term for it. When a government uses military force to kill civilians in order to achieve political objectives, that is terrorism, regardless of whether it is done by a non-state actor with car bombs or by the most powerful military in history with Hellfire missiles. And the political objective here is transparent. It is regime change in Venezuela. It is the restoration of right-wing governance throughout Latin America. It is the reassertion of American control over a region that has been moving toward independence and left-wing politics for the past 2 decades. Representative Leger Fernández understands this, which is why her condemnation is so powerful and so necessary. She is connecting the dots that the mainstream media refuses to connect. She is showing how the pardon of Hernández reveals the utter cynicism and hypocrisy of Trump's alleged drug war. She is demanding that Congress fulfill its constitutional responsibility to check executive military power, and every single person watching this should be calling their representatives and senators right now, today, demanding that they support war powers resolutions to block Trump's Venezuelan adventure, demanding accountability for the killings that have already occurred, demanding that the classified Justice Department memo supposedly justifying these strikes be declassified and released to the public. Because if we allow this to continue, if we normalize the idea that the president can wage war without congressional authorization, can kill people without trial, can ignore international law with impunity, then we are not living in a democracy anymore. We are living in an authoritarian state that uses democratic language to obscure its fundamentally lawless nature. Trump is testing how far he can push executive power, how much violence he can commit, how many norms he can shatter before facing meaningful resistance, and every day that Congress fails to act is another day that those boundaries expand and those norms erode. The moment you just witnessed, Representative Leger Fernández, standing on the floor of Congress calling out Trump's hypocrisy, is the kind of moral clarity we need from every elected Democrat right now. Not triangulation, not both sides equivocation, not careful political calculation, but righteous fury at the lawlessness and violence being committed in America's name. This is what resistance looks like. This is what opposition to fascist creep requires, naming clearly and forcefully what is happening, connecting it to the broader pattern of authoritarian governance, and demanding that institutions act to stop it. And make no mistake, what is unfolding in the Caribbean is fascism in practice. It is the subordination of law to executive will, the use of military violence against racialized others to consolidate political power, the manufacture of external enemies to justify domestic repression. Trump's entire second term has been characterized by this logic, from the mass deportations to the attacks on democratic institutions to the explicit threats against political opponents, and the Caribbean strikes are simply the international manifestation of the same authoritarian impulse that animates his domestic agenda. So when you watch that clip of Representative Leger Fernández speaking truth to power, when you hear her call Trump's drug war hypocrisy of the highest degree, understand that this is not just about policy disagreement. This is about fundamental questions of law and morality and human rights. This is about whether we will be a nation that murders people in international waters without trial and then pardons convicted drug kingpins based on their political alignment. This is about whether Congress will fulfill its constitutional role or surrender completely to an imperial presidency unbound by legal or moral constraint. The fight against these Caribbean strikes is inseparable from the fight against Trumpism more broadly because they represent the same rejection of democratic governance, the same authoritarian impulse, the same racist dehumanization of brown and black lives, and that fight requires all of us to be as clear and as forceful as Representative Leger Fernández was in that chamber, to name what is happening without euphemism, to demand accountability from our representatives, to refuse to allow this descent into lawlessness to be normalized as just another political controversy. Lives are at stake. Constitutional governance is at stake. The very soul of what America claims to represent in the world is at stake, and silence or complacency in the face of this moral emergency is complicity in the violence being committed.